Welcome to the Dream Novel channel. Before starting to listen to the fun in this clip, don't forget to like and comment, so that the admin will have the encouragement to continue making clips. Let's go listen. Channel Dream Novel. Chapter 226, Voldemort, Treasure Chest of Dark Secrets. The small room was in utter chaos, marked everywhere with scorch marks from fiendfire. Even the mirror of Eriste hadn't been spared. Its golden frame had melted, its surface now gray and cracked. Quirrell was gone. When he had touched Harry, his body had begun to blacken rapidly, like a statue melting away, until he was reduced to nothing but ashes. Voldemort, too, had transformed into a ghostly apparition, fleeing the room the instant Quirrell died. Now, only Harry, Kyle, and Dumbledore, who had just arrived, remained in the room. As Dumbledore entered the room, he frowned slightly, casting a thoughtful look in Kyle's direction. But after a brief pause, he turned away, a gentle smile crossing his face. "If I'm not mistaken, you were about to use Finite Incantatem just now. It seems Professor Flitwick was right, you've mastered that spell, which is no small achievement." "I just happened to read about it in the library over the holidays," Kyle replied, helping Harry up from where he had collapsed on the ground. "I can't say I'm able to pull it off every time, but I'm glad you're here." "No need to be so modest, Kyle." Dumbledore winked. "Have I ever mentioned that you are one of the finest young wizards I've encountered? You never cease to amaze me." "You're too kind," Kyle said, a bit embarrassed. "If you hadn't refined the charm, I'd never have had the chance to learn it." "You're the true master here." Dumbledore chuckled. Now, you're making me blush. It was more a happy accident than anything else, and not solely my work." While they exchanged pleasantries, Harry, still lying on the ground, suddenly extended a trembling arm. He felt like there might still be hope for him, but the lingering effects of Quirrell's curse left him in searing pain, unable to form complete words. If he could, he would have made it abundantly clear that he desperately wanted to go to the hospital wing. "Oh, Harry. I'm so sorry," Dumbledore said quickly, moving to help him up and guiding him toward the hospital wing. Kyle accompanied them. As they returned to the castle, Dumbledore suddenly stopped, turning to look at Kyle. "Fiendfire is a very dangerous form of dark magic," he said, "and its effects go beyond mere burning. If you have no urgent matters, I suggest you stop by the hospital wing for a checkup as well." "Yes, Professor," Kyle nodded. "But before that, could I go back to the dormitory? Cedric and the others must be worried sick." "I understand," Dumbledore replied, "but don't delay." With that, he led Harry away. Kyle, however, didn't return to the dormitory. Instead, he made his way to the second floor, heading toward Myrtle's bathroom. After facing Voldemort, a thought had struck him. The basilisk. Kyle had always believed that only someone with Slytherin blood could control the basilisk, but now he realized he'd been mistaken. If Riddle had controlled the basilisk through a bloodline 50 years ago, what about 50 years from now? Newt had once told him that all artificially bred creatures shared a unique trait. To control these dangerous creatures effectively and prevent them from turning against their creators, a specific will would be imposed on them from the start. This process often left their minds muddled. The more powerful the creature, the stronger the confusion. The basilisk was no exception. It would be impossible for it to remember a wizard's face and voice for long. Not to mention, the basilisk in the Chamber of Secrets had been asleep for 50 years, enough to reset its memory entirely. If it would forget even after a short 5-day sleep, there was no way it could remember Tom Riddle's commands after half a century. Besides, Riddle didn't even have a physical form anymore, so how could he control the basilisk now? But if it responded to a soul, why not Harry's? As the last Horcrux, Harry also carried a fragment of Voldemort's soul, making him similar to Riddle in a sense. There was no reason it couldn't work. Kyle felt as though he had uncovered the key to the problem. He was eager to confirm his theory, especially while the effects of the Felix Felicis were still in play. It had guided him here for a reason. Arriving at the bathroom, Kyle quickly removed the quill wedged between the door and the frame, then stepped inside. Myrtle wasn't here, and the room was silent. Kyle opened the entrance to the Chamber of Secrets with ease, mounted his broom, and descended. The passageway was as dark and damp as ever, but this time, Kyle felt none of the nervousness that had gripped him during his first visit. He flew swiftly down the corridor, reaching the stone wall and entering the chamber. Kyle looked up at the Slytherin statue and thought it seemed subtly different from before, though he couldn't pinpoint exactly how. It felt almost more lifelike. But that didn't seem possible. The statue had stood here for over 1,000 years. Why would it suddenly change? He squinted at the statue's eyes, trying to study them more closely, but a thought of Dumbledore waiting in the hospital wing broke his concentration. If he lingered here too long, Dumbledore might come to his dormitory looking for him, which could cause complications. "Forget it, I'll figure it out later," Kyle murmured, snapping back to reality. He shook his head to clear his thoughts, then opened his suitcase. Inside were the remaining dozen roosters, which he placed at the entrance, feeding each a potion to strengthen them. Once everything was in place, Kyle turned his gaze back to the statue's face and let out a hissing sound. This was the critical phrase in Parseltongue he'd learned long ago: "Speak to me, Slytherin, greatest of the Hogwarts Four." The giant stone face of Slytherin shifted, its mouth began to open wider and wider, forming a vast, dark cavern. From somewhere deep within the statue, a slithering creature began to stir and move upwards. "Stop!" Kyle commanded, closing his eyes tightly and clutching his suitcase. This was the moment of truth. If the basilisk ignored his command and continued to emerge, he would have to open the suitcase immediately. A dozen roosters weren't much, but their combined crowing would still pose a deadly threat to the basilisk. Kyle's heart raced. He had never felt so tense. It felt both like an instant and an eternity, but soon Kyle realized that the faint sound of slithering within the statue had ceased. The basilisk really wasn't moving. A cold, rasping voice echoed from the statue. "Obey your command, Master." It worked. Kyle patted his chest in excitement. His earlier guess was correct. The basilisk was merely a magical creature. It couldn't distinguish Slytherin's bloodline or soul. What truly controlled it was that phrase in Parseltongue to open the statue. That phrase must have been recorded in some special way, perhaps at Hogwarts or somewhere else, but Kyle was certain only a true heir of Slytherin could find it. The method for creating a Horcrux, now the basilisk. Voldemort truly was a treasure chest of dark secrets. That extra effort of calling him Professor had definitely been worth it. Channel Dream Novel. Chapter 227. The Cunning Dumbledore. Kyle arrived at the hospital wing as quickly as he could after commanding the basilisk back to sleep. Harry was lying peacefully asleep in one of the beds, while Dumbledore stood nearby, speaking with Madame Pomfrey, who looked distinctly displeased. "Last year it was a dark wizard, and this year it's the Death Eaters," she said, casting a sidelong look at Dumbledore. "So, what will our defense against the dark arts professor be next year? Dark Lord himself? I wouldn't be surprised at all if that were the case." Dumbledore merely smiled, offering no rebuttal or defense. Whether it was Orin or Quirrell, he was indeed responsible for their appointments, and he bore much of the responsibility. Just then, Kyle stepped into the room. "Oh, just in time, Kyle. We were just talking about you," Dumbledore said, quickly ending his conversation with Madame Pomfrey as he moved toward Kyle, only to be promptly nudged aside by her. "You need to be checked in immediately," she said, glaring at Kyle, her expression so severe that she seemed more intimidating than Voldemort himself. Kyle shot a pleading look at Dumbledore, hoping he might intervene, but the headmaster had suddenly developed a deep fascination with a potion bottle on the table and seemed oblivious to Kyle's silent appeal. Madame Pomfrey didn't dwell on her irritation, though. "All right, stand still." She waved her wand twice in front of Kyle, and a soft white light glowed at its tip, eventually forming a cloud-like mist that wrapped around him. She studied the glowing mist intently before finally relaxing a little. "Very well. No trace of dark magic. You should be grateful, she said with firm resolve. When Harry Potter was brought in, he couldn't even get a full sentence out. She handed Kyle a bottle of potion, then guided him to one of the sickbeds. Poppy, might I have a quick word with him? Dumbledore asked gently. Just a couple of sentences. It won't take long. Madame Pomfrey frowned but nodded. If you say so, Headmaster. But the boy's just had an encounter with Fiendfire, he needs his rest. Dumbledore inclined his head, acknowledging her concern without pressing further. After drinking the potion, Kyle felt a deep heaviness settle over him, and before long, he drifted into a deep, restorative sleep. When Kyle woke up, it was already the next morning. The noise in the hospital wing had stirred him. He could hear Madame Pomfrey angrily scolding, likely shooing Fred and George out. Good morning, Kyle, a familiar voice greeted him. Opening his eyes, Kyle saw Dumbledore standing beside his bed, smiling warmly. The scene felt oddly familiar, just like last year, and around the same time, too. Good morning, Professor, Kyle replied, sitting up. How's Potter? I'm glad you asked, Dumbledore said. He's out of danger and should be awake by lunchtime. Would you like something to eat? The kitchen is serving pork cutlets this morning. No, I'm not really hungry, Kyle said, shaking his head. That's a shame, because they're especially delicious today, Dumbledore replied with a hint of a smile. Kyle half expected Dumbledore to ask why he had gone into the restricted area, but he didn't. After a casual conversation, Dumbledore finally remarked, "Oh, by the way, remember to return Fluffy to Hagrid later. He was quite worried last night. Funny, at first, I thought Quirrell was the one who hid him. It took me an hour to realize that if Quirrell only wanted to pass the trapdoor, he wouldn't have needed to hide Fluffy in the first place. Besides, hiding a creature as large as a three-headed dog isn't exactly easy. Unless, of course, there's a magical item involved, like a suitcase or a bag of sorts." Air. Kyle felt a little embarrassed, realizing his actions had left a trail. In fact, the bit of Felix Felici's he'd used only worked for about an hour. "Sorry, Professor." "It's quite all right, Kyle. I'm not blaming you. Honestly, even if you hadn't taken Fluffy with you, Quirrell would have found some other way to get through." Kyle nodded. He had already guessed Dumbledore's intentions. Subconsciously, he glanced around the room. It was just him, Dumbledore, and Harry, who was snoring loudly. The one person he truly wanted to avoid at the moment, Madame Pomfrey, wasn't there, no doubt busy shooing away more students outside. He decided to shift the conversation to lighter topics, steering it from Quidditch to exams, and finally to the House Cup. Dumbledore listened patiently, seemingly happy to indulge him in small talk. But, eventually, Dumbledore brought up the inevitable. As soon as Kyle finished talking about the House Cup and was preparing to change the subject again, Dumbledore said, "Speaking of the House Cup, it reminds me, Kyle, did you by any chance see a bright red stone yesterday?" "Well, there goes that topic," Kyle thought, muttering under his breath, not the easiest subject to dodge. But when Dumbledore asked, he nodded and said, "Yes, Potter was holding it, but it fell into the Fiendfire." "Yes, that's what Harry told me," Dumbledore replied, his expression thoughtful. "But it's quite peculiar. The Philosopher's Stone is an exceptionally magical artifact, even Fiendfire can't destroy it. I went back later, but there wasn't a single trace of it left. Quite impossible, really. Did you check carefully?" Kyle murmured, "Maybe it rolled into another room." "I checked thoroughly," Dumbledore said, smiling. "It seems you already knew the Philosopher's Stone was there." "Well, Potter mentioned it," Kyle said, shrugging slightly. During breakfast, he and Ron were always talking about how to stop Professor Snape from stealing the Philosopher's Stone from the restricted area. This wasn't entirely a lie. Kyle had indeed heard Harry and Ron discussing the Philosopher's Stone on several occasions, whether in the Great Hall or in the corridors, conspiring loudly enough that it was impossible not to overhear. Most people thought they were just spouting nonsense and didn't pay attention. Sounds like they learned quite a bit from Hagrid, Dumbledore chuckled, shaking his head. He looked at Kyle again. So, you don't know where the Philosopher's Stone is either? Kyle remained silent. In that case, it must have been taken by that Niffler, Dumbledore said with a twinkle in his eye. I reviewed the images from the Mirror of Erist yesterday. He winked. Perhaps I'll pay Newt a visit, he should recognize that Niffler. Channel Dream Novel. Chapter 228, A Reward for the Niffler. Kyle sensed things were slipping out of his control. Professor. He said with a nervous laugh, I don't remember the Mirror of Erist having a replay function. Isn't it like any other mirror? That's true for most versions of the Mirror of Erist, Dumbledore replied, but I've made a small adjustment. Are you familiar with the pensieve? Kyle nodded. It's an alchemical device that lets you view memories. Indeed, Dumbledore said, sounding pleased. I attempted to connect the Mirror of Erist to a pensieve, so that whatever appears in the mirror could be preserved as a memory in the pensieve. To be honest, it was far more complicated than I anticipated, but I succeeded in the end. So you can see everything that happened in the mirror? Kyle asked, his throat feeling suddenly dry. Perfectly. Dumbledore replied, a glint of mischief in his eyes as he seemed to savor Kyle's reaction. It's unusual for a Niffler to be in the castle, and even more unusual that it managed to solve a supposedly foolproof barrier. Dumbledore then stood up, preparing to leave. Well, I won't disturb you while you rest. The Niffler can't have gone far, so I should pay Newt a visit to see if he recognizes it. Wait, Professor. Kyle blurted, stopping him. Yes. Is there something else? Well, if it's a Niffler, it just so happens that I have one, Kyle said, reaching into his pocket and pulling out a palm-sized Niffler. Dumbledore turned back, looking a little surprised. So the Niffler was yours all along? Kyle forced a polite smile, choosing to ignore Dumbledore's teasing tone. If the headmaster really hadn't known, he would have gone straight to Hagrid or Professor Kettleburn rather than seeking out Newt. This wasn't about identification, it was clearly a playful, if pointed, hint. Actually, I just remembered, Professor, Kyle explained. I let him out to play with me for a while earlier, and he must have wandered over to the mirror during that time. The Niffler looked up at Kyle with wide, blank eyes, and seemed to catch on. It quickly moved its little paws protectively over its pouch, but it was too late. Under Kyle's deft hands, a large pile of shiny objects soon spilled out, Christmas ornaments with sequins, metal clasps, a handful of galleons, sickles, and, finally, a bright red gemstone. So it was here all along, Kyle said, feigning surprise. Sorry, Professor, I had no idea. That's quite all right, as long as it's been found, Dumbledore replied, retrieving the Philosopher's Stone. At that moment, the Niffler let out a mournful wail, wriggling and clawing at the air in protest. I see I've taken something it values. Dumbledore murmured thoughtfully. With a subtle twist of his fingers, he conjured several glittering gems in various colors, each roughly the size of the Philosopher's Stone, and held them out in his palm. How about I trade you these? Dumbledore held out his hand to the Niffler with a smile. As a reward for passing my test, you may have them. As soon as he opened his hand, the Niffler stopped his fussing. The Niffler's eyes widened at the gems, though tears of frustration still glistened at the corners. With a sorrowful cry, he reached for them, but Kyle lifted him up just in time. Professor, he says he doesn't want those, Kyle said solemnly. Dumbledore paused. He doesn't. Emicham. Kyle nodded seriously. You see, I can understand what the Niffler is saying. He's asking for a real reward. The Niffler stared at him in disbelief, then began squirming even harder, letting out increasingly desperate cries. But Kyle ignored him, even covering its eyes. Dumbledore's expression grew curious. And what reward does he have in mind? Well, he feels his home is a bit cramped and would like you to expand it a little, Kyle explained, holding up the leather suitcase next to him. He was thinking, maybe as large as the Forbidden Forest during your summer break. Dumbledore, who likely already knew that Kyle owned a suitcase like Newt's, seemed to piece things together. His expression turned even more amused as he looked between Kyle, who was keeping a straight face, and the Niffler, who had gone limp in resignation. "Kyle, did he really say that?" Dumbledore asked, clearly holding back a laugh. "Yes," Kyle said firmly. "I'll vouch for Potter's grades as proof." By now, the magical creature had completely given up, hanging limp in Kyle's grasp, defeated. "Well, all right, since I promised him," Dumbledore mused. "But the size of the Forbidden Forest, that might be a bit ambitious. After all, I still need to find a new defense against the dark arts professor during the break, so I won't have that much time. How about half the size of the Forbidden Forest? That should be enough for it, don't you think?" "No problem at all, Professor," Kyle replied, smiling. "I thank you on behalf of the Niffler." "Oh, Potter. When did you wake up?" Harry, who had been lying on the bed across from them, was now sitting up, staring at Kyle and Dumbledore in bewilderment. "I thought I heard someone talking about grades, and it woke me up," Harry said, rubbing his face in confusion. "How long have I been asleep? I can't believe the exam results are out already." "Don't worry, you've only slept for one day, and the exam results aren't out yet," Dumbledore reassured him, coming over to his bed. "If you recover quickly enough, you might even be able to make it to the Quidditch match tomorrow." "Oh, thank goodness." Harry breathed a sigh of relief, then suddenly remembered. "Sir. The Philosopher's Stone, it fell into the flames." "We have to, no need to worry, my boy. What you're saying is already outdated," Dumbledore said calmly, pulling out the bright red stone and holding it in front of Harry. "The Philosopher's Stone is perfectly safe, you see." "Phew," Harry exhaled, visibly relieved. "I'm so glad I didn't destroy the Philosopher's Stone. There's no need to be so nervous. Even if you had destroyed it, it wouldn't have mattered much, as we never intended to keep it here permanently." "Pardon?" Harry asked, baffled. "But, your friend Nicholas." "Oh, so you know Nicholas?" Dumbledore's eyes sparkled with genuine delight. In truth, he was quite pleased. Unlike Kyle, Harry's responses were far more straightforward and didn't tend to involve unexpected surprises. This was precisely the kind of conversation Dumbledore enjoyed. Channel Dream Novel. Chapter 229, The Mysterious Gift from the Weasley Twins. Harry had many questions, but Dumbledore answered each one with patience. Before long, Kyle located Madame Pomfrey and requested to be discharged. Although a bit reluctant, she agreed after another examination, confirming Kyle truly had no lingering issues. As he left the hospital wing, Kyle glanced at the still soulless Niffler, smiled, and took a handful of glittering gem shards from his moleskin pouch. He scattered them across the courtyard, watching as they sparkled in the sunlight. These were the fire crab gems he had collected. After learning occlumency in Newt's suitcase, he'd ventured into a fire crab lair to gather plenty of these smaller gem shards to make his map appear more valuable. Though the shards were smaller than the gems Dumbledore had, Kyle had amassed quite a lot. When scattered, they glittered like stars on a dark night. The moment Kyle released the gems, the Niffler, with its eyes fully restored, sprang into action, eagerly gathering every shard from the ground. Kyle sat beside him, resting his chin in his hands, and glanced up in the direction of the hospital wing. Kyle wasn't surprised that he hadn't managed to steal the Philosopher's Stone. In fact, he had anticipated this outcome. After all, the stone was the one thing that could allow Voldemort to regain a body, and Dumbledore would never let it slip from his control. What did surprise Kyle was Dumbledore's willingness to help him expand his suitcase. Honestly, he hadn't expected much. He'd thought Dumbledore would dismiss the idea. Instead, after only a brief hesitation, Dumbledore had agreed. It was an unexpected windfall. This meant Kyle no longer needed to attempt the suitcase expansion himself, which saved him a lot of time. He had originally planned to use his vacation to enlarge the suitcase's interior a bit more, an endeavor that required releasing the undetectable extension charm for 2 months in a row, a task he found unbearably tedious. Soon, the Niffler finished collecting every gem and scurried back to Kyle's side. A true treasure hunter, the Niffler hadn't missed a single gem, and in the process, had even found 2 copper nuts hidden in the most unlikely spots. Still, he seemed a bit dissatisfied until Kyle handed him a leaf transfigured into the likeness of the Philosopher's Stone. The little creature's face lit up immediately. In a way, Nifflers were easy to please. When Kyle returned to the castle, he happened upon Fred and George, who were about to leave and each holding a large, beautifully wrapped box. Kyle. Fred looked a bit surprised. We were just about to go see you. How come you're better so soon? George wondered. I was never really sick, Kyle replied. The visit to the hospital wing was just a formality. It was Potter who had the real problem. Oh. I'm sorry, George murmured, looking down at the box he was holding. We got you a present. It's fine, Fred said. Go on, open it and see if you like it. Sorry. Did he actually just say that? Kyle gave them an expressionless look and made no move to accept the box from Fred. This wasn't his first encounter with the twins, and he could tell from the mischievous glint in their eyes that whatever was in that box was unlikely to be a genuine gift. How did you know I was in the hospital wing? Kyle asked, changing the subject. Actually, it wasn't just us. Fred, realizing they couldn't easily fool Kyle, took the box back, deciding they'd give it to Harry later instead. It's all over Hogwarts, George explained. Quirrell tried to steal the Philosopher's Stone, but a few brave young wizards caught him and managed to stop him after getting past loads of obstacles. Kyle, you borrowed the Marauder's map just so you could go down to the underground chamber, didn't you? Fred mused. A 3-headed dog. A moving wizard chessboard. Death Eaters. Fiend Fire. By Merlin's Socks. This adventure's richer than everything we've done over the past 10 years combined. You really should have asked us. George said with a touch of regret. Even our little brother Ron got involved, but we were left out. Next time, for sure, next time, Kyle said, waving his hand dismissively. Fred and George couldn't help feeling Kyle was merely humoring them. So it's settled. You'll definitely include us next time, George reminded him. Otherwise, you're getting the same Christmas present every year, a quill. And it'll be the cheapest one we can find, Fred added. That's just mean, Kyle laughed, shaking his head. Fred and George quickly headed off. They still wanted to find Harry and give him their carefully prepared present. Once they were gone, Kyle was soon surrounded by another group of people who had also heard about what had happened in the underground chamber and were eager for details. Kyle finally managed to slip away from the crowd of curious students, but when he reached the entrance to the Hufflepuff common room, he realized someone else was waiting for him. I knew you'd be heading back to the dorms, Hermione said. So I thought I'd wait here in advance. There were too many people back there, and we couldn't get through, Ron muttered. Hermione shot him a glare. Alright, what do you want to know? Kyle asked, sounding resigned. But make it quick. I really don't want to keep repeating myself. How's Harry? How did you get past the barriers? The two asked simultaneously. Potter's fine, Kyle answered, looking at Hermione. When I left, he was talking to Dumbledore. You can go see him if you like, but Madame Pomfrey may not be too happy about it. As for the obstacles, Kyle turned to Ron. With the right approach, they're not too hard to get through. For instance, about the winged keys, you could use a bowtruckle or a master key to open the door directly, without having to catch any keys. Oh. Ron moaned, looking disappointed. They had been so proud of their efforts to find the right key, and here Kyle was, telling him it hadn't even been necessary. And about the enchanted chessboard. Ron began, but Hermione cut him off. Don't ask, Ron. Of course Kyle would have no trouble with those tests, she said, a bit impatiently. We have to hurry to the hospital wing to see Harry, or else Madame Pomfrey might not let us in if there are too many people. Yes, you're right. I almost forgot. After thanking Kyle, the two of them quickly hurried off toward the hospital wing. Channel Dream Novel. Chapter 230, Kyle's career. Hermione was right. By the time she and Ron reached the hospital wing, it was packed with students who had come to see Harry. His friends, members of the Quidditch team, and those simply curious were all crowded around. And, of course, there were a few who came to gloat, such as a certain first-year Slytherin who would rather remain unnamed. Everyone had some excuse for Madame Pomfrey to let them in. Please, Madame Pomfrey, just let me in. The Quidditch match is tomorrow, and I really need to see Harry. It's important, Oliver Wood pleaded from the front of the line. If anyone was desperate to see Harry, it was Oliver. Gryffindor was more than 500 points behind Hufflepuff, but until the last match, there was still a sliver of hope. Miracles did happen, after all. But without Harry, their key seeker, they had no chance. They might even end up in last place, setting a record for Gryffindor's lowest score in a decade. The thought alone made Wood shiver. If they lost, Professor McGonagall would probably have him hanging from the astronomy tower. So, despite Madame Pomfrey's refusals, Wood clung to his request, refusing to budge. Nearby, Dumbledore, who had just exited the hospital wing, watched the scene with a faint smile. It seems that Harry is quite popular, with so many people concerned about him. Standing beside him was another figure, Snape. Surprisingly, he refrained from his usual snide remarks, instead gazing at Dumbledore with a troubled look. "Is this your plan?" he muttered. "Letting Potter face the Dark Lord alone? He could die. Trust me, Severus." Dumbledore replied gravely, "Harry will have to face Voldemort one day. It is unavoidable. He must learn to overcome his fear." "Ha, making a child the savior." Snape scoffed, though it was unclear if he meant Harry or Dumbledore himself. "He's just as mediocre as his father, arrogant, rule-breaking, showing off at every chance, drawing attention to himself. Honestly, I see no chance of him defeating the Dark Lord." "You see what you want to see, Severus." Without looking back, Dumbledore turned and began walking toward the castle. Other professors find him humble, friendly, and not without talent. Personally, I find him quite likable. Not without talent. Snape's expression turned incredulous, as though he'd just heard the Ministry of Magic was giving away Felix Felicis for free. If Dumbledore had made that remark about Kyle, Snape wouldn't have reacted so strongly. Although he disliked Kyle, Snape couldn't deny that the boy was rather clever. After all, even Snape himself hadn't been able to brew the perfect draft of living death in his second year. But Harry Potter? The boy could barely manage the simplest of potions without mistakes, and this was supposed to be talent. As Snape thought of Kyle, he suddenly asked, almost to himself, "So, you really don't know what happened in the underground classroom that night?" "Of course, Severus. I have no reason to lie to you," Dumbledore replied, shaking his head. "Hogwarts is vast, and not even I can see everything." "What about the mirror?" "He has never looked into the mirror of Erist, not even once." Dumbledore's eyes grew distant. "In this, he is more clear-sighted than any of us." Snape was silent for a long moment before he spoke again. "And you weren't worried that Quirrell might get his hands on the Philosopher's Stone? I assumed you would be watching him closely." "Since the day I brought the stone here, I have been concerned," Dumbledore admitted, looking up. "But even so, Severus, there are always exceptions." As he spoke, the two of them reached the restricted area. Fluffy had already been removed, leaving the entrance room empty and quiet. They passed through the trapdoor and descended to the room below. Neither Dumbledore nor Snape needed broomsticks. The descent was as effortless for them as walking down a flight of stairs. After landing, Snape's expression shifted, and he bent down to pick up a leaf from the floor. "Chomping cabbage." If I remember correctly, Pomona placed Devil's Snare here. Perhaps someone thought Devil's Snare was too easy and decided to add a bit of a challenge, Dumbledore chuckled. I don't think it was Quirrell, Snape muttered, thoughtfully rubbing the leaf between his fingers. Casually cultivating dangerous plants and leaving them around the school. If Quirrell hadn't arrived early, Potter and his friends wouldn't have needed the hospital wing at all. Such reckless disregard for safety. Aren't you concerned he might become the next Dark Lord? Snape didn't specify who he was, but Dumbledore understood. You're mistaken, Dumbledore replied, shaking his head. Harry and the others came down on their broomsticks. Even without Quirrell's early arrival, they would have been unharmed. And as for Kyle, he cannot, and will not, become the next Dark Lord. He has a warm family and close friends to confide in. He's passionate about learning magic, but he's not driven by a need for power. And yes, he even has a career he genuinely enjoys, which makes him fundamentally different from Voldemort. Career? You can't possibly mean those useless amulets and shoddy maps. Snape suddenly grimaced, feeling an oncoming headache. If that was Kyle's idea of a career, then Slytherins had certainly been his main customers. Dumbledore's eyes twinkled. But the students seem to like them, don't they? Fine, Snape grumbled. Even if you're right, what about occlumency? If there's no ulterior motive, why would he need to master occlumency in his second year? You know as well as I, Severus, that we cannot use legilimency on students. Dumbledore's tone grew firm. It was merely a test, Snape scoffed. One he performed so boldly, without a hint of subtlety. But you must understand, Severus, having secrets is not unforgivable. Your prejudice against Kyle, however, might be. Snape's frown deepened, but he held his silence. Ah, yes, Dumbledore added with a sigh as if remembering something. Due to the Fiendfire incident, I couldn't keep what happened in the dungeon from the families of Kyle and Harry. They should be arriving soon. Do you recall, Diana visited the school once last year because of Orin. Despite all these years, she's still, as spirited as ever. Snape's face darkened visibly. When? She should arrive shortly, Dumbledore mused. Though it may be Chris who comes instead. Very well, Snape said, turning sharply and heading out of the room without another word. Are you going to greet her? No. What do I care if she arrives or not? Snape replied, not bothering to look back. I just suddenly remembered I forgot to pick up a batch of potion ingredients I ordered in Hogsmeade. Now the fun in this clip is over. Which listeners haven't liked and commented yet? You can press like and comment to encourage the admin. Find the fun in the next clip. May the listeners be happy forever.